All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Susan McKenzie, CEO at the Emergency Services Foundation, and I'm very happy to welcome you today to this presentation. Before we begin, I'll acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands we're on, which are all over the place, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So what we're here today to talk about is a piece of work that the Emergency Services Foundation has undertaken recently. We wanted to understand the needs of family members of emergency service volunteers. So everywhere across the sector, people are very much more aware of the role that families play in supporting emergency service volunteers. And of course, without our volunteers, our model of emergency management just wouldn't exist here in Victoria. So it's really important that we understand what family members need and try and do what we can to support them. So we worked with Right Management to do this piece of work, and Kristen Barton from Right Management has done work for the Emergency Services Foundation before. And Kristen is going to, and Louise, I believe, are going to do this presentation today. So I'll hand over to you now, Kristen.
Thanks, Susan. And I have got both Louise and Veronica, my colleagues, are on the call today too, and you'll be hearing from each of us who worked on this project as we go through. So welcome everyone. Thanks for having us, Susan, and thanks for the opportunity to work with ESF again. We really love this work. We do, at Right Management, we do quite a lot of work in emergency services. We've just finished off doing quite a bit of work with DELP, who became DECA, and in particular the forest fire operations cohort there. We've been doing some great work with them. We're also the Commonwealth provider of career support for the Defence Force. So there's a lot of related work that we're doing at the moment. But yeah, great to be here and great to participate in this work. Just a little overview of what we'll be taking you through today. So we'll be a bit of background about the study. We'll be talking about what we heard from participants about how they feel about having a family member who's a volunteer, the challenges for family members of volunteers, their level of awareness of support services available, what they desire in terms of support and services. And we also sought feedback from them about some of the ideas that Susan had shared with us that ESF and partner agencies were thinking about in terms of possible future service offerings, and we sought their feedback about those and how likely they would be to access those services. We looked at how that support that they were seeking might be different depending on the career stage that their volunteer family member was at. And then we'll finish up with a bit of recommendations and closing from Susan. Feel free to ask questions as we go, and we'll be stopping for questions at the end too. I'm sharing my full screen now, so can't see comments in the chat. Is someone happy to keep an eye on those in case we get any questions in the chat?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Thanks, Susan. If you could do that, that'd be really handy. And call out, feel free to put your hand up if you've got a question, or put it in the chat function. We'll either deal with it as we go, or we will come back to it at the end. So this is pretty fresh, pretty hot off the press, this study. I think we submitted our draft report to Susan last week, and this study was conducted during December and January, December last year, January of this year. And what we were looking at was how people feel about their partner being a volunteer, the challenges they face, services that they would like to access and have accessed, and how that varies by career stage, as I said before. Just a bit of an overview of who participated in the study. So we had 28 participants, and you can see here that the majority of them came from, had partners, who were volunteering with the CFA or SES. And then there was a sprinkling of other organisations represented as well. About 10% of them had a family member who participated as a volunteer in more than one organisation. And you can see we had one person each from Red Cross, Coast Guard and United Church. And the majority of people that we spoke to in this study were partners or spouses of emergency services volunteers. And you can see there's a range of other represented, relationships represented too. So about 10, was it about 15% were parents. There were grandparents, siblings and children involved as well, adult children, that is. And the bulk of the people we spoke to had partners or family members who were long-term volunteers. So most of them, 75% or so, had been volunteering for more than 10 years. There are about 25% of people who participated who had a partner or family member that had been a volunteer for less than 10 years. And here are some quotes from people. Actually, I might just hand over to Veronica to talk to these, actually.
Sure, thanks, Kristen. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. So when we conducted the study, we did ask people their feelings of how they felt around their family member volunteering for emergency services, and most of the study participants reported being proud. That word was used significantly throughout all of the discussions that we had. And they really felt that despite any challenges that they might be experiencing with their family members being involved, and we'll touch on them further as we go, they were proud, as I said, and happy that they were giving back to the community. And they also felt that their family member was getting something out of it as well. There were only 3 people that we spoke to that had negative feelings in relation to their family members volunteering, and 1 who was neutral. The thing that did vary, whilst the consistency was there in terms of the feeling of pride, the thing that did vary was their sense of community and their sense of connectedness. There were some that really experienced a sense of community and in informal networks and formal networks with other volunteer family members. But there were some who really felt quite isolated and wanted to have that connection with family members of other volunteers. And as Kristen said, we've picked out some quotes there that show you the range of responses and were indicative of the responses that we got speaking to those family members of volunteers there. You can move to the next slide. Fantastic, thank you. So in terms of, we asked them about the challenges they experience in being a family member of a volunteer, and there was consistency in 3 main types of challenges that they experienced and articulated to us. The first was very much around practical and logistical challenges that impacted their sense of well-being. So 2/3 of the study participants articulated that the most challenging part of having a family member as an emergency services volunteer was the practical and logistical impacts. So that was anything from the pager going off in the middle of the night and waking up all of the family, missing important events, birthdays and Christmases, even things like picking up the burden of family duties and home duties when the family member was called out to volunteer. They did mostly acknowledge that that was part of what they signed up to in terms of becoming a volunteer, but they did, as I say, really stress the impact of that on their well-being. The other practical and logistical challenges was juggling their volunteering with their paid employment, and again impacting their well-being in the sense that some of them were concerned that if their partner or family member was called out to an emergency during the evening, that then they had to go to work the next day and they may have been fatigued. So that was, impacting their stress levels and their sense of well-being, that concern for their family members' safety. And one of them, for example, owned their own business, so they were concerned that when their family member was called out to volunteer, that they were losing revenue from that business, and again impacting that their sense of well-being emotionally and financially. The second most common challenge was directly mentioning the emotional and mental health impacts. So that was, as I said, the second most comment theme that came along. And most of them reported concerns, yes, for the volunteer, but the impact that then had on the family member. Many of them mentioned that they weren't sure how to handle the concerns they had about their family member who was volunteering, their mental health, and that would then impact their mental health and their emotional sense of well-being. They also mentioned that it would the volunteer often had flow-on effects to them in terms of whether it was anger or shutting down or PTSD, and in a couple of quite extreme instances, suicidal ideation. So, obviously it was impacting the volunteers, but also their family members as well. One of them did really emphasise that they felt the wellbeing checks for volunteers were a bit perfunctory, and that was concerning them and impacting not only the volunteer but the family member, because they felt they weren't getting the support, that their family member wasn't getting the support that they perhaps needed. The third common theme in terms of challenges having a family member volunteer was around concerns for their safety. And again, that flowed onto their sense of well-being because they were so concerned. So it was a commonly mentioned challenge that the family member would be called out to do some volunteering work, and they felt that there was a lack of information and communication about the family member's safety, and that, you know, led to a great deal of stress for them. So you'll see that we try to address these common challenges that came out of the study in the recommendations. And I'll hand over to Louise for this element.
Thanks, Veronica, and hello, everyone. We asked survey participants around questions around their level of awareness of the services that are already currently available to them. And half of those interviewed were aware of support services available, and half were not aware of services available to them as a family member. So of those respondents who were aware of the support services, half mentioned counselling and half mentioned peer support, and 2 respondents were aware of both of these services. One family member wasn't aware of support, but said she was comfortable that she could access information about available support services if she needed to. And another expressed that they felt there could be more support available. And just over half of the respondents who were aware of support services available had utilised one or more of these services. Many responded that they would utilise the services if they felt they needed to, and all respondents that had utilised some form of support service reported that they found the support useful. There was one respondent who shared that they were aware only of peer support, and they indicated that they would actually have a preference to access support services which were more independent and anonymous rather than relying on peer support alone. We also asked questions around desired services and support. So we asked survey participants for their ideas about what sort of support would be useful and valuable to family members, and over half provided suggestions for services and support that they would like to see offered, and many proposed multiple ideas. We've categorised these by 3 key themes. The first being practical support. So this is support such as hands-on assistance within the home to help with domestic demands when their volunteering family member is away, and also other aspects such as financial support, for example, compensation when the volunteer is using their own vehicle whilst they're using it for volunteering purposes. Another theme was a strengthened connection and with the community. And some of the ideas on how this could be achieved were centred around activities and events such as a family social day, or again, peer support. And finally, mental health support was the other key thing we identified. And some of these ideas centred around counselling services, information on how they could potentially access the employee assistance programme, and also mental health training to enable the family member to better support their volunteer family member. Now, we asked survey participants a range of questions centering around how likely they would be to access or participate in a range of possible supports should they be available. These are all services and support that are under consideration by the ESF. Now, we asked, in most instances, the level of likelihood to access these services ranging from very likely on a scale through to very unlikely. And in 2 instances, it was a yes or no question. So first of all, we asked if survey participants would be interested in education to improve their mental health literacy. And in this instance, we found that 2/3 were in favour and indicated that they would take up this option if it was available, and 1/3 said they would not. We also asked if they were interested in a network for family members to connect to. And around half of the participants reported that they would attend a network to connect with other family members of volunteers, and half said they would not. And it's worth mentioning that in many cases, those who were not interested did go on to elaborate and reinforce that the reason that they wouldn't take up this option was because they already felt a sense of connection to an informal network through their family members' depot or work centre. And in fact, there were some really interesting quotes that came through as well to this regard. And I'll share a couple with you. One was that there's a very strong informal community within the CFA. It's like a family. When my parents passed away, the Ballarat Brigade was a marvellous support. And another mentioned that the CFA are a close-knit community and support each other and drop around the house, and we feel very supported this way. Then we asked some further questions, as I say, on that scale of very likely through to very unlikely to participate. And the first was a wellbeing support booklet, which was tailored to the agency. And participants expressed a similar level of interest in wellbeing support and pamphlets. 20 responded that they would be interested in reading such a resource, and only a very small number of participants shared that they would be unlikely or very unlikely to read it. We also asked about family wellbeing expos. So a family wellbeing expo that would educate, empower and link and help build resilience, that would be held in person. And 2/3 of participants shared that they would be likely or very likely to attend a in-person wellbeing expo. It's worth noting that for those who said they would be unlikely or very unlikely to attend, in many instances, the reason provided was due to a perception that this event would likely be held in Melbourne or a location which was too far away in distance from their regional location. We also asked a question around whether if this Wellbeing Expo was held online or via video conferencing instead of in person, where the participants would likely attend. And we found that there was a lower interest level should it be in this format. The number who responded as likely or very likely had dropped to almost 50%, and a greater number reported that they would be unlikely or very unlikely to attend. Now, a common theme here amongst those who advised they wouldn't attend online was a lack of access or perhaps a resistance or discomfort with digital technology. The final thing we asked was about accessing other options, for example, counselling support, and we found that 23% said they were very likely and 12% likely to access these type of services, and with a similar number indicating that they would be unlikely or very unlikely to take up such an option. We also asked about the family members' support needs at different stages of their volunteers' career. And over 2/3 of survey participants stated that they felt there was a need for different support at different career stages. And the first year, that induction stage, was the most identified stage as needing the most support. Now, amongst those who elaborated on this point, some of those common themes were that in the first year, a greater support was required around Areas such as resources to build awareness of available services for the volunteer and the family member, and information around the volunteering commitment, so to help the family member understand what to expect. Now, during service, some of the aspects that were highlighted was additional support, such as counselling. So these would be required after the realities of volunteering became apparent or following attendance to a traumatic incident, and also the ongoing opportunity to provide confidential feedback via perhaps a website or app. And then also post-service. What we found was that some people shared that if a volunteer has been very involved in their local agency but no longer can respond to incidents and emergencies, that volunteer and their family can lose that sense of connection, which of course then can have a flow-on impact to mental health. And one person shared with us that to maintain that network and connection, one agency has an older volunteer, and what they do is they now do some cleaning and remain involved by providing other duties post-service. So I'm going to hand over now.
I might just pause.
Yeah.
I might just pause there for a sec, Louise, and just check whether we do have any questions at this stage before we move into the recommendations piece. Susan, I'm not sure if anything's come through on the chat function from anybody.
One thing, no, there hasn't yet, but one thing I think you didn't explain at the start is about the number of people involved in the study and the sort of saturation of that.
Sure. So we had 28 people involved in the study. Obviously, that's a pretty small sample size when we say there's 100,000 volunteers in Victoria, but the focus of the study was always as qualitative research. And as much as we had a relatively small sample size, we absolutely felt that saturation was achieved with the themes that we were hearing, and we could really narrow those themes down to a small number of themes that we heard about consistently throughout.
And, I must say that recruiting people for ESF to get involved in a study like this is incredibly hard because we don't have direct access to people. So it was really quite difficult. Suzanne's from the CFA. Suzanne's got a question.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to try and better understand a couple of slides ago, the one that talked about the services that the family members would be interested in. I was really interested in a very high number wanting mental health literacy, but it was in 60 something maybe, but a low number actually wanting the services themselves, 20 something. I would normally think that would kind of correlate. So just wondering if you can help me understand what aspects of mental health literacy. Is it possible to unpack that a little bit, or maybe you're coming onto that? I don't know.
So if I take that question, the main one of the core themes coming through when family members wanted to improve their mental health literacy, it was so that they were in a position to better support their family member. So rather than seeking the support themselves, for example, counselling, it was so that they could be better equipped to provide that assistance themselves. Does that answer your question, Suzanne?
It makes complete sense. Thank you.
And it's interesting, isn't it? I think it ties into the earlier research we did that was around transition to retirement, where we did certainly hear that the partner of the individual was certainly the main go-to support person, and we know that there's a reluctance to seek professional help in the emergency services cohort. And certainly I remember when we did that research, when people were talking about the support they access, they talked largely around their own partner or family members as their initial support network, and then professionals as being beyond that, and only in more extreme circumstances. But the partner was very much the go-to person, and through this research we were hearing that partners understand that they have that role but don't always feel well equipped, especially if their volunteering partner has experienced a traumatic incident or experiencing PTSD. And we did have a small number of people that were in that more extreme category where that partner was feeling a bit out of depth, but it was primarily about supporting their partner rather than supporting themselves. So it's an interesting one. Thanks for that question,
That's
Susan.
really helpful. Thank you.
And Suzanne, that's really saying what the Answering the Call study said as well. You know, we look after everyone else, but we don't look after ourselves.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We're developing an induction video for families, so it's really helpful to have that crystallized. So I'm making sure that that's kind of how and how we're pitching the information.
And I think this slide here is more about here's some ideas, and that final one doesn't necessarily capture the counselling one fully, because we know that when we looked back at what people had accessed, those who had accessed services were, you know, half of them had accessed either counselling or peer support. So it was coming up there in terms of they had accessed. That next question was about what other ideas do you have? Here's some things. So it's not necessarily capturing the importance of counselling, I think, when we compare it to the other options. I think it's better captured back here when we're looking at what have they actually accessed and what are they actually aware of. And the two coming through most strongly were the counselling and peer support. In terms of what people were aware of and had accessed, and that they did value those services. They did say that they found them helpful and they would access them again if it was the circumstance was appropriate. Thanks for that question, Suzanne. Any other questions from people before we move on to the recommendations?
Not at this point.
Thank you. Veronica, I'll hand back to you now if you'd like to talk through these.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. So, you know, as we said, that there was 28 people in the study, and they varied in age and gender and location, and as you saw, relationship with the volunteer. So, you know, there's not a one size fits all. So our recommendations are really based on the predominant challenges that you saw that we recognised when we spoke to the study participants. So in terms of that first large consistent theme, which is around the practical and logistical challenges that has that flow-on effect to the mental health, we recommend considering a network for family members of emergency services volunteers. So as I mentioned earlier, in some instances that's already in place, whether it's formal or informal, but ensuring that's offered more broadly and consistency will enable that support. And it could be things like sharing meals or babysitters, you know, that practical support. But as we said, that really has that flow-on effect to the well-being. And many respondents did indicate that they would prefer local support and local connections, and that there would be a flow-on effect to their mental health in terms of having that lessening sense of isolation. So we also recommend considering an opt-in contact list for family members, so that they can volunteer, so that they can, you know, opt into that if they choose to, and then support each other and have those connections and lessen that sense of isolation. We also suggesting investigating offering a range of practical and financial support solutions. So whether, as Louise mentioned, you know, if it's somebody using their car, personal car, but for volunteering, you know, it might be discounted registration fees, or it might be vouchers for meals or cleaning, but something to support the logistical and practical challenges that, as we said, flows on and impacts them from a mental well-being as well. And that, you know, that could be a sector-wide approach. One of the other things we mentioned there is considering a review of the distribution list for the pager messages. One respondent mentioned that 80% of the messages they receive throughout the night are not relevant to them. So it was, you know, waking them up, waking the family members up, but for messages that weren't even relevant to them. So disrupting the sleep and the well-being as well there. In terms of the second broad range of challenges around the emotional and mental health impacts, as we said, the connection piece, we're recommending considering a wellbeing expo with, as Louise mentioned, the aim would be education, empowering, linking and helping to build resilience. And further to what Louise said, we found that when we spoke to people in the study, some of them were concerned around location of that. A lot of the study participants were regionally located, so that's, you know, certainly a consideration. So that builds into that next piece of the local family and community days. That's another recommendation, help building that network support, especially where the networks are not so strong. And perhaps they're not even branded as a mental health initiative. They could be, you know, a community day, and that's one of the flow-on impacts from that, to deepen the connections and provide those that emotional support. So many of the participants, as we've mentioned earlier, were not aware of mental health support services being available to them as family members of volunteers. So we're recommending ongoing awareness and education around that, so that they can utilise that when they need to. And then we've touched on this as to Susan's question, but mental health literacy training for the family members. And look, my understanding is that there is some training currently provided through ESF in terms of the Mental Health Matters program. And really, it's as Kristen was saying earlier, it's really the family members that we spoke to, the volunteers, when the volunteer had PTSD, or in some instances, or just got angry or withdrew, you know, they'd been to an incident and they were having a reaction to that, the family member was not sure how to respond and really felt that they would benefit, many of them said, from knowing how to respond to that. It would help the situation and help their sense of well-being if they had some mental health literacy support in terms of how to best handle that situation. And as I mentioned earlier, in terms of, you know, some of the people we spoke to saying that some of the wellbeing checks are a tad perfunctory, you know, perhaps reviewing the wellbeing checks for volunteers in terms of, one was the timeliness and the depth of them, and where possible face-to-face. The comments were that, you know, sometimes the time elapsed between the incident and the check was too great, and that it was just a quick phone call and both parties just said what they needed to, but it wasn't really in depth, and where possible face-to-face could really add value. And so the other thing that we talked about there that Louise mentioned, a lot of people, you know, had some interest in, was whether it's a flyer, a pamphlet or a book, but many people mentioned having that available to pick up and read if and when they need to would really help with their sense of well-being and knowing what support's available. And then the third big theme you may remember that came through as a challenge was the concern for family members' safety. So what we're recommending there is to improve the timeliness of the communication to family members during emergencies to support with that. So, you know, where partners are volunteering, it might be implementing a group, and it could be centralised and opt-in. It might be a communication channel such as WhatsApp that would enable quick and effective dissemination of information to all the family members in relation to the safety of volunteers who've been called out to an emergency. But we also do note that the common theme was relatively low digital literacy and comfort with technology. So there may be some IT support that's required to help them with the setup of that technology. Thanks, Kristen.
Great. Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Veronica. Just love to hear from people in terms of reactions, questions, comments. I know we've had some questions already, but maybe there are some more following on from the recommendations.
Yeah, does anybody have any questions? Obviously, when we do this work, things always come out that are relevant for the sector. Some of the things there are clearly not things that agencies are going to do, but there's always something useful for the agencies, and obviously something useful for ESF as well. I mean, in our strategic plan, families is really very much there as a priority. And so that's why we're doing this work, with a view to presenting to the Stakeholder Council some ideas of things that could be done sector-wide. So that's how we will use this work. And so in terms of the next steps, that's what we'll do. We'll share it with the Stakeholder Council, which is the heads of agency or their representatives, and have a discussion at their meeting about this research. But I am interested in any reactions that anyone might have. If you'd like to write something in the chat, if you don't want to speak, I'd be very interested. Suzanne, tell me if this is useful for the work you're doing. Rachel, I can see you're online here, and sort of almost half of the people were SES volunteers. Faye, you've got a question?
To comment, Susan, following on what you've just said, we've been advocating, hello everyone, I'm Faye with the SES. We've been advocating for some time in our local council area to do a community safety day annually. And there's ad hoc bits of family or community days that happen, you know, across the state, but it would be.
Oh, we've lost you, Faye. You've just dropped out.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can now,
Okay.
yes.
It would be great to have a family and community day annually that becomes just a standard thing sector-wide, because these issues are across the sector, and I know that the agencies all have strategies for dealing with all these sorts of things, but they really do apply across the agencies. They're common to all the agencies, so it would be great to have a sector-wide approach, and maybe that's something that you can take to the stakeholder council, and that even we can take it back to EMV and to other sort of forums as well. It'd be fantastic.
Well, Faye, actually, interesting you should say that, because one of the ideas that I had that could be of benefit was we have now the annual emergency services match, where loads of people come together to be part of that, whether they're part of the exhibition or whether they're on the ground representing their agency, that, you know, we could potentially do something in line with that, where people are sort of there anyway. Now, I hear what was said by the participants that, you know, some people want regional things as well, but I think we have to start somewhere, and potentially lining something like that up with the emergency services match could be good. Therese, just tell us about the comment you've just put in there about Neighbour Day.
Yeah, hi everyone. Hey, Susan.
Great to see you.
Yeah, it's been a while, hasn't it?
It has.
Yeah, thanks for the research, everyone. It's interesting, like we hear those themes as well. I did note the small sample size. I wonder what the impact that has, though, on such a, if, you know, because we do hear some things and then you wonder if it's from a small group or it's representative. But Neighbour Day is a national initiative, and it's something that SES gets on board with and we push out from a community perspective, but it's also something that last year and the previous years we've tried to introduce as an internal concept as well, because we think Neighbour Day has really strong relationship to mental health and wellbeing, community connection. So I wonder if there's a way to use an existing concept like Neighbour Day, which is the end of March, and build on that from emergency services, and picking up your recommendation that you made there.
That's definitely a possibility worth looking at for sure, Therese. Thank you.
Thanks.
Does anybody else have any comments?
Suzanne, I think you're on mute. And then I can see
I
Faye's got a hand up again.
I haven't done that for a little while, actually.
Right.
Look, the key is the communication piece. I think it's the fact that we found it difficult to find you family members to talk to really speaks to how difficult we find it to communicate with family members. And certainly for a volunteer organisation, we struggle to communicate with our vols at times. We use a lot of electronic means of communication. You've picked up on the varying levels of tech savviness. I think the challenge is huge, but I think what's helpful about this is kind of, I guess, with limited resources, we might be able to target it a little bit better. But did anything come through around kind of ways to communicate? Were there any consistencies? Because I would imagine you might have had 28 different views in terms of how to best communicate with family members.
We didn't specifically explore that issue of communication more broadly. We do know that there was a low tech savviness of this group. So the fact that they were recruited the way they were through the snowball kind of approach through the ESF network suggests that this group was probably more connected than many might have been
Mm.
to network. The fact that we even found them and they put their hand up. We didn't specifically explore communication preferences, but when they were given the chance, for example, to participate in the interview via phone or video con, I think there were 2 people that said either and the rest all said phone. So that kind of said to us that, you know, they're not that tech savvy. They were probably at the older end of things too. They were, you know, there was only 25% that were in their first 10 years of volunteering. Most of them had been volunteering for longer. And when you look at that composition of the volunteering, you can see we've got a proportion of people who are in that older age group, again, which impacts preferences around, you know, use of technology in communication. But, you know, the pamphlet / booklet flyer was something that was flagged and people tended to be pretty happy with that idea. I would have expected people to say, what about just the website? But that was something that was less mentioned, the use of technology to access information.
I know, and I'm just thinking we have a digital induction booklet for our family members that we'll attach our video to, but how many will that get through? So yeah, there are some barriers that we need to overcome, but you know, all the
And I think it's
information is
that
really helpful.
covering off on both, you know, is there a, you know, and I'm also thinking about minimizing paper. So is it a one pager that has a link to a website that has the video, etc. So you're covering off both options.
Thank you.
Suzanne, would you be kind enough to write in the chat just a comment about those communication challenges? Because I'd like to include it on the newsletter as a sort of a reaction. That'd be great. Emma, I can see you've got your hand up. Emma's from Life Saving Victoria.
Thanks, Susan, and hello. Thanks for the information. It was really, really helpful. And I'm sorry we weren't a bit more organised to get some people in your study. I think it would have been invaluable. But we a big area for us is actually communicating to parents of younger members. We have a significant younger cohort, so we're seeing people exposed to trauma, you know, at ages of 15, you know, 14, 15 years old, and our average age of our lifeguards, which are paid and over the peak period are, you know, is kind of 19 years old. So first job. And I think at times my anecdotal observations are people don't quite know what they're getting into or what exposures they may have, and certainly, you know, maybe perceived as a sport for many coming into life saving. So they do a bit of sport and then go on patrol on weekends. So it's I think a pamphlet idea and communications that can actually go out to parents in that education piece. And Suzanne, I'm really really interested to see what your kind of video might be. So an ongoing issue for us is how do we educate the people around members to know what to do, and I think the you know, upskilling their mental health literacy is one thing, and certainly providing information to at least prepare them to what they may be exposed to.
Again, Emma, would you just write a comment that I could use, please? So that's really interesting with the mental health literacy, because we have been running the Mental Health Matters program now, and we've done a lot recently with Life Saving Victoria that have been really, really well received. So we did the first year just for volunteers as part of the state government Valuing Volunteers grant. And then in the second year, we started inviting family members. Last year, we had more family members. And I have to say, the ones where the family members came to, you've just got to sit there and watch them. And they sit there with their partner and they talk. And they have a conversation, and they invariably come up to me at the end of the night and say, do you know what? That's the first time we've actually ever spoken about this. And the ones who were reluctant to bring their partners, there's been men with tears in their eyes come up to me and said, I wish I'd brought my partner. You know, it was just so out of their comfort zone that they would bring their partner to something down at the station like that was perceived as being a training program. They just didn't feel comfortable doing it. But those that were brave enough to do it were, you know, they absolutely loved it. So I think there is that huge challenge to get through, and it's about breaking down those barriers, you know, of getting people getting people together and helping them realise that if somebody volunteers, then their partner sort of is almost volunteering as well, because they have to, you know, they put up with so much. Yeah. Does anybody else have any comments to make or questions to ask?
Susan, it's Faye. Can I just make one other comment?
Yes.
And that's come up in the study, and very clearly, and Suzanne's referred to it, it can't be assumed that everyone has the latest technology or lives in a region with reliable, stable reception. And I think that's one of the things, it's almost like we're expected these days to have the latest iPhone and with the updated version and all these things. But there's plenty of people who are volunteering who don't have the economic means to purchase all the latest updates of everything. Plus, they just might live in a region which doesn't have good reception. So the people in the study have made that very clear that they prefer to do things face-to-face or a brochure. So, though, I mean, that sounds very old-fashioned, but obviously that's also what people do need, because we find that a lot as well in terms of communication, that assumption that everyone is just online all the time with the latest equipment is just not, you know, it's just not the reality for a lot of people.
Babe, would you put that in the comments, please?
Sure.
That'd be great. Is there anybody else? Is there anyone there from EMV? Georgia, you said that this was timely for work you're doing. Tell us about that. Sorry,
Yeah,
I'll put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. So I'm coming in to deliver the Emergency Responders Health Program that might have a component which also looks at volunteers. There's quite a bit of scope work that needs to take place on that, but we've also got another team member here who sits in volunteers as their sort of key focus. So it's interesting to hear a little bit more about how this is playing out for volunteers, similar to how some other people have mentioned. Ideally, it would be great to have a bit of a more diverse cohort, bigger numbers, so that you can find out whether some things like what communication needs and things like that do cluster amongst certain ages of family members or different demographics, and potentially even among different agencies, as it sounds like there might be some areas that have a younger volunteer cohort than others. Yeah, at the moment, just really interested to hear how it's all playing out. But that's where we're sitting so far.
Okay, that's fine. Well, I think, you know, it's fair to say this was always only going to be a toe in the water, you know, and we knew that. And we knew when we had trouble recruiting that it was always going to be a small sample. But everybody who does these studies sort of gets to this saturation point. And it was a fairly random group of people from all over the state. Which, you know, sometimes I recruited when I was going around talking to people about Tony's Trek and things like that. So they, you know, they were pretty random. So I think that, you know, that's good in terms of representation. So I think it's given us some good themes going forward and some good ideas. So I can see a couple of comments in the chat there. Let me see. From Faye, Emma, and I think that's Suzanne. Yeah, beautiful. So if anybody else wants to leave something there, so I'll say to you that this report is on ESF's website. If you click on research and then go under ESF research, you'll find a copy of the actual report there that you can refer to. And we might put this recording up there as well, so that if people want to listen to that as well, they can. So I'm just going to stop the recording now, and I will say to everyone,